Welcome back to the channel, guys. On today's video, we got the 69 Camaro. We are upgrading the rear brakes to these disc brakes from Baer and the front single piston calipers to dual piston calipers from Baer. Let's do this, guys. So we're going to start off with the rear brakes and we're going to jack it up at the rear diff. But first, we got to chuck the front tires so that way it doesn't roll on top of us. So the best place to jack it up is at the rear diff, at the pumpkin. And we're going to jack it up high enough to get the wheels off the ground. And then we're going to put some jack stands underneath it. So that way it holds the weight, and then we're going to lower it onto the jack stands. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to take off the cover so that way we can drain it. It's a 1/2 inch size bolt. So if these covers have been on for a while, you don't want to pry it specifically on one edge because that would bend and warp your cover. So you kind of want to work it out and then pry it evenly around the whole entire cover. So once you break the seal loose, you want to start working it around the entire cover and keep breaking it loose and not just pry on one single spot. Now, if this is your first time doing this and you never mess with gear oil, it is pretty smelly, so you don't want to get it like all over your arms and shirt and everything. But even if you get it on your hands, you're going to smell it later, so just be careful about where you're going to get all this fluid all over. And obviously make sure you have a drip pan underneath it. So once we pull off the rear cover and it starts draining out, you're going to let that drain for a little while. And that gives us a chance to go ahead and pull off the wheels. So just a heads up, guys, because these are older cars, it might not be a metric socket for the wheel nuts. On ours, we had to use a 13/15 wheel socket. So next, we're going to pull out the rear brake drum. And I'm going to show you guys a trick on how to make it easier to pull off. If you release your parking brake, it's going to be a lot easier to take it out because some guys forget to do that. So make sure your parking brake is loose. So once we pull off both the rear brake drums, we're going to start working on pulling out the axles. Now that we let the rear end drain for a while, we're going to pull out the cover. Make sure you have all the bolts off and try not to pry on any of the edges, especially the edges where it seals to the surface. Now we're going to spin the axle so we can rotate the carrier until we see the snap ring. And then we're going to pull out the snap ring to get access to the C-clips and pull those out so we can pull the axles out. Make sure you have some strong snap ring pliers because we had some that we bought from Amazon and the tip snap, so we had to pick these up from Harbor Freight. So a differential in this Camaro is a Eaton Detroit True Track. Once you pull a C-clip, the plug will come out and then you'll pull out the spacer that goes in between the axles. This spacer keeps the axles from going to the center. So now with that spacer removed, we can push the axles to the center and then we can remove the C-clips. So here's a close-up shot. You can see when we push the axle to the center, then this C-clip right here could get pulled out. If that spacer wasn't installed, then these axles on their own could get moved to the center. And if that C-clip falls out, these axles will just come out of the axles with your entire wheel. And then pretty soon your wheel and your axles flying down the freeway. Now with both C-clips removed, we can just pull out these axles on either side. So with the axle out, you have 4 bolts on this backing plate that you can remove. And then if you remove your parking brake, this whole assembly should come off. However, we ended up taking off all the springs and the brake pads and everything and then removed the whole assembly. I didn't record us pulling off all the springs and the brake pads and everything, but here's us taking off the brake, emergency brake or parking brake cable. So what you gotta do is you gotta find these pliers that are kind of circular at the tip, and then you gotta squeeze it evenly and then pull it out. Another trick that I've seen is you could use maybe like a 1/2 inch or 9/16 inch wrench and just push it on the edge and then pry it from behind. That should come out. So now we're going to use this seal puller and then pull the seal off and replace it. We're going to replace the seals with the National. Here's a part number. So these seals should work for the 12 volt GMs. I think they're the same for the 10 volts, but I'm not sure. But we have a 12 volt. Now when you tap it in, you want to tap it in evenly. And if you have a seal installer, you want to use that. So we just get it started with this. And then we're going to go to our seal installer. So on the Baer brakes, you want to mount the caliper away from the shock. So because on ours, we have a staggered shock setup, which means one shock is pointing back and one shock's in front of the axle. We're going to have to mount the driver's side caliper towards the front of the vehicle and then the passenger side caliper towards the rear of the vehicle. So we're going to reuse the stock bolts that we used that held the dust cover on. And we're going to mount this caliper steel bracket on. And make sure the lip is facing towards you. The caliper bracket will be mounted to this bracket. Now you got to push the bolt so that way the nut is on the inside and the end of the bolt is facing to the middle of the vehicle. This hardware, these bolts and nuts came with the kit, so you're gonna use those. So you put bolt, washer, and then that'll go to the bracket that attaches to the axle, and then you'll put the bracket for the caliper behind that, and then you're gonna put the nut on that. Now we're gonna tighten up the bolts that hold the base steel bracket to the axle, and these should be 3/8 bolts. If they are, you're gonna turn them down to 33 foot-pounds. I like to use a little bit of Loctite, the blue stuff, so that way it holds in place. Pay attention to the brake line as you're gonna have to bend it so it aims forward towards the caliper. So next, we're gonna mock up the brake caliper for the rear. Now you notice that we put it towards the front of the car, it clears everything, but if we try to mount it towards the back of the car, it will hit the shock. So this is the reason why we have to mount it on the side that faces the engine. So next, we're gonna torque down the 12mm bolts that came with the kit. These will bolt the intermediate bracket to the base steel bracket, and we're gonna torque them down to 85 foot-pounds. Now that both torque, we're gonna insert our axles back into the rear end. And now we're gonna do the same thing to the other side, but when we install the base bracket, you can see that we have the bolts facing to the rear away from the shock, because on this side, the shock is in the front of the axle. On the side that we just did on the driver's side, it was behind the axle. So this is what's called a staggered shock setup. So on this one, we have to have the caliper facing the rear of the axle. Also, you'll pay attention to the hard brake line. You're gonna have to bend it so it faces the rear of the vehicle. So I'm gonna go ahead and speed this up. But again, I like to use blue Loctite for stuff that I want to torque down and hopefully it doesn't come loose. Now, if it's stuff that's gonna encounter a lot of vibration, I'll use a red Loctite. But the blue Loctite is good because if you ever gotta take it apart, it's not that hard to break loose. So now we're gonna put the axle in on both sides and we're gonna push them all the way in. I like to use a magnet to install the C-clips. And then once you push the C-clip on, it's real easy to push it onto the axle. Then you pull the axle out so that way the C-clip stays engaged. So for the left side, you can see how I attach the C-clip to the end of my magnet. Then I push the C-clip onto the axle. And then I'll hold the C-clip in the axle with my finger and I'll pull the magnet out. Once you get the C-clip onto the axle, you pull the axle slightly out and that'll hold it in place. So next we're gonna put the axle spacer, then the plug, and then the C-clip. So we're gonna slide in the spacer in between the axles. Now there shouldn't be any resistance here, it should slide in pretty easy. And then we're gonna put the plug with the pointy end, push it in. And then we're gonna close, or we're gonna put the snap ring by closing it with the snapping pliers, pushing it in with our fingers, and then releasing it once it gets to the grooves. So now we're gonna put the rear brake caliper together and the brake pads in it. So you wanna make sure that this long tab is facing towards the outside of the brake caliper, and then you wanna slide it in so that both tabs are over the edge of the caliper, so they're actually on the outside of the caliper. So if you look here, you can see how they're both on the outside and above the caliper. So next we're gonna put these little metal springs on the edge of the brake pads, and these springs push a little bit of pressure up against where where it slides on the caliper, so that way it's not too loose. And then once you put one on each side of each brake pad, you're gonna slide the brake pads into the caliper, and then close the caliper up because you're gonna have one bolt loose, so that way to open up the caliper to slide them in. So once you get the brake pads in there, you're gonna close up the caliper, and then we're gonna put the bolt that holds the caliper together, and then you're gonna tighten that one down. So now you put your rotor that came with the kit on, and then you're gonna test fit to make sure that the brake caliper slides over the rotor and that the holes that mount the brake caliper to the intermediate steel bracket bolt up. And then you want to check for clearance all the way around, so that way you make sure nothing rubs. All right, so here's the part number for the gasket that we're gonna use in the 12 bolt. So you want to make sure that the mating surface on the rear end and on your cover are clean. Once you get the bolt holes lined up, you want to start the bolts with your hand, and then you can run them in with the air ratchet or electric ratchet like we are here. Make sure you put all the bolts in by hand first, so that way you make sure all the holes line up. And then when you tighten it up, go in a crisscross pattern before you torque it down. For a torque spec, I found different sources. Some say 15 foot-pounds, and I found as high as 22 foot-pounds. So we did 18 foot-pounds to play it safe. So now we're going to connect the braided steel lines that came with the kit. We're going to put one side to the hard lines that are on your Camaro, and then the other side would go to, using these banjo fittings, will go to the rear brake caliper. You can see how there's a washer on each side of the banjo fitting. Make sure that your nipple for your bleeder is at the top part of the brake. So the final steps is you're going to top off your rear differential and you're going to bleed the brakes after you do the front ones. That's going to be on the next video, guys, so stay tuned.